Dear colleagues, thank you very much for accepting our invitation on refinancing 9.25, just defined today, 0.25 percentage point below the previous term. As per the decision made, Mr. Galstyan is going to present now the message, and then you will have the chance to ask questions, please. Good afternoon. So, at the 12th of December 2023 meeting, the board of the Central Bank of Armenia decided to decrease the refinancing rate by 0.25 percentage points, setting it at 9.25. In November 2023, the 12-month CPI inflation rate decreased and comprised minus 0.5 at the end of the month. The 12-month core inflation rate in October stood at 0. In the fourth quarter, economic activity globally in main trading partner countries of the Republic of Armenia continues to slow, and this is reflecting declining international commodity prices and softening global inflation rates. In this context, the central banks of the trading partner countries will maintain relatively contractionary monetary conditions in the near future. As a result, the effects on the Armenian economy from the external sector are expected to be deflationary. Economic activity in the Republic of Armenia remains strong in the fourth quarter, driven by high growth in the construction and services sectors. While external demand is slowing, domestic demand continues to remain robust, driven by strong growth in private consumption. Given weak deflationary pressures from the external sector as well as the implemented contractionary monetary policy stance, the inflationary environment remains low, which is also reflected in a somewhat slower pace of wage growth as well as somewhat lower inflation expectations. In this context, the board of the Central Bank of Armenia finds it expedient to reduce the policy rate. The board will continue to be prudent in ensuring that adequate actions are taken to regulate demand and stabilize inflation expectations. As outlined in the monetary policy scenario, the 12-month CPI inflation rate will remain below the target level in the near term, and then gradually increase and stabilize around the 4% target in the medium term. The Central Bank Board estimates that the risks to inflation deviating from the projected path are mostly balanced. In the event these risks materialize in either direction, the board will respond accordingly and ensure that the price stability objective is met. Thank you. Questions? Arka, Yelena Navizian. Mr. Galstyan, what is your estimate or forecast per the growth of the economy and inflation for the coming year and for the current year? With your permission, there is one more question. What's the revenue you expect for 2023 of the Armenian banks, and what's the ratio to previous year? And generally, what would be your characterization of the situation in the banking sector of Armenia? How concordant is the data with the reality, given specifically the information that several Armenian banks are now negotiating trade? What would be the landscape of the Armenian banks 2024? Thank you. Thank you very much. Just as regards the revenues, then we will respond to that in written because we don't pick the statistics with us related to the financial system. As regards the economic growth and the growth of inflation, then per year the forecasts for economic growth were slightly more positive than we even expected in the previous forecasts, and annually I guess economic growth will comprise about 8.3%. As regards the next year, then for the next year we expect quite solid growth, 6.1% per the estimate at this moment, the economic indicator. And as I mentioned, the main drivers will be demand-based. mostly consumption. And I'm sure you've seen the figures for the retail. Obviously, you've noticed that per October we have 17% growth per annual distribution. Now, as regards the inflation, then for this year we expect zero inflation, about close to zero, but for next year that might be close to the figures that we just mentioned, to the targets we've planned. As for the bank's landscape, at this moment you may note that there is a process, and per that process any merger, any transactions related to purchasing banks, then they're going to come to the central bank to get the preliminary agreement, the green light from the central bank to be able to act in that direction respectively. At this moment nothing official has been communicated to the central bank. There might be negotiations all the time among various banks, mergers, purchases, whatever. We haven't been notified officially yet. Please. Thank you. Question related to medium to long-term relocated population and how active they are consumption-wise. Supposedly, we see less influx, but this is just an observation with the naked eye, to say so, and it might not be of any weight. Any calculations pertaining to changes in the number of the relocated population, any trends of growth or reduction? For instance, maybe less remittances in the last month, for example, from the Russian Federation citizens or not Russian Federation citizens specifically. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's been remittances or wiring from Armenia. Thank you for the question. We've been collecting certain data on our own, and Haik is going to tell you about the data of the remittances. Some reduction in the overall landscape of remittances, less reduction in the transfers or wires equivalent specifically to non-trade purposes wires through the banking system. That's how we call them. If I'm not mistaken, that's January, October. Last year, 40% reduction. Hike is going to deliver the figures in more detail currently. As regards the others, meaning the other figures that we've been following just as you have been doing that, publications by other public agencies, well, the board considered tourism as well, tried to understand the overall estimates published by the Tourism Committee of the Republic of Armenia as per the most recent report. So it was over 20%. It was 40% of growth from the very beginning of the year, but worth considering the slight slowdown in the growing pace compared to the previous year. That's just 4%. Meaning there is growth, I mean, but only 4%, meaning it has slowed down generally. It has slowed down. In such a situation, we've been observing that, I also mentioned in the press release, that the dynamics we witnessed last year, with the economic driver being external demand mostly, has changed significantly this year. This year we've been observing, at least starting April 2023, internal demand has galvanized to a certain extent. First of all, emanating from the fact that more public expenditure has occurred here, and also more involvement of monetary capacity in the country, because hypothetically construction boom followed by import of goods, furnishing all those apartments which were built essentially in that regard, equipping, furnishing. We've been noticing that because there's been quite solid growth in consumption loans or credits. I'm sure you remember it was not that big last year, and the operations of the banks last year specifically, not through loan products specifically, was more active. I mean, more revenue in the banks, not from loans, and this year it is more into a natural flow, growing significantly in the banks as well. We've been witnessing internal demand growing to a certain extent, which will also observable in the economic growth figures that I just mentioned, and that's been, by the way, the basis of our decision in putting the refinancing 0.25% less. Thank you. Mr. Makaran, yes, as regards this very topic, there are several questions. I'll raise one at this moment. Mr. Galstyan, so 0.25 less, as you said. Should we expect a proportionate reduction in the interest rate for the loans? Supposedly, if you go up, then that's going to go up too, some kind of restrain kind of the inflation. So, if that's expected, then to what extent? And you also said, I mean, in the press release or in the statement, you said that's 0.5%, minus 0.5%, but you expect 4% growth. That might stabilize here. So what that forecast is based on, and what were the pre-estimates kind of. So because we're already at the end of the year, supposedly that's going to pop up next year, supposedly. So when we get to the point of the 4%, will it be possible to revisit the refinancing, meaning increase it? Well, I can show this chart if you don't mind. We're at 2024, mostly that's the solid black line, and then that's the trend of the inflation, clearly showing where we might approach our target of 4%. So in terms of policy planning for the central bank, when we say midterm, we mean 3 years of horizon as a rule. Now, as regards the 0.25 reduction in the refinancing rate and how it's going to be reflected in the loans or deposits, then I might draw you backwards a little, and then we can come forward together. So since December 2020, we started specifically contractioning with the monetary policy with 4.25% of refinancing at that time. Through this contractioning cycle, through the whole period of time, we reached the maximum by the second quarter of this year, if I'm not mistaken, when the rate was 10.75. I mean the interest rate, meaning we've grown 6 over percentage there. But naturally that increase was not fully reflected in the loan interest rates. And this, I mean, the borrowings interest rates have been much softer through the whole cycle of an increase, mostly lagging specifically. I mean, it was not very strict. Hence, retraction following reduction in the interest rate might specifically be under certain lags and more consistent. Aren't the banks complaining of this change? Because you're going up 6 points, and supposedly it's not proportionate in their case. Would that just business-wise be reasonable for them? Have you had discussions? Frankly, we've had discussions. I may suppose there have been some grievance, but everyone understands it's not for the banks, but for the citizens of Armenia. Because the mandate we have under the constitution is, of course, stability in the price. And I'm hoping, just hoping, that we all here in Armenia have the perception and understanding that inflation is evil, and the central bank has been deploying all of its tools permanently in order to keep inflation on a low and manageable rate. Because low and manageable or controllable rate is the prerequisite to stable, dynamically developing economies. Because sustainable, low, predictable inflation environment provides for a conducive environment of investing in the country. So I guess everyone has that perception, has that understanding. I'm sure many have returned positively on this, because a low, predictable inflation supposedly takes us away from a situation where we have to revisit the wage policy. Specifically, there might be certain processes taking place frequently that are not natural, meaning consumption travels to the past. I'm thinking that sobriety dominates here. Everyone understands that having proper lower manageable rate of inflation is an ultimate goal. Corollary to that question, is there any policy defined for that purpose, specifically given next year's changes? What would be the factors to influence this? What would be the behavior of the central bank? Hard to say currently. I mean, to say accurately. Naturally, we have certain pathway in perspective. However, with certain obscurity, uncertainty, I would refrain from any precise statements. I wouldn't say we're data-driven, as they would say in English, but nevertheless, our policy depends on the neutral rate, the rate that's not observable. However, that neutral rate is influenced by a number of factors, and the behavior of our policy, meaning more expansionary or contractionary, specifically depends on the overall environment. Unless some contingencies come into the play, and we'll simply continue doing what we've been doing in the most conservative, restrained, well-balanced manner, so that in the time frame mentioned we come closer to the target level. There's one more point. Pay attention to this chart specifically. This is the expectations of inflation. You might see, despite the orange is the high inflation expectation, specific weight on the chart, as you may see, it's been reducing, but reducing slowly, and the uncertainty range is quite significant. In such circumstances, apparently one of the most important goals is to anchor the expectations per inflation. The issue is that the inflation expectations are asymmetric, meaning de-anchorized, essentially going to happen much faster than bringing it back. So our experience for 2014-2015 disinflation policy specifically comes to assert of the fact that the latter might last very long, so that we're able to anchor the expectations per inflation. Thank you. Mr. Galstyan, the public assistance that's the assistance by the government to those who've arrived from Artsakh, how much does that influence monetary policies, and how much does it contribute to changes in the inflation-pertaining environment? Well, that's where we might converse increasing more components of demand, because more fiscal space supposedly impacts consumption in the first place. So per our assessment or estimates of October, meaning the significant growth in the retail capacity or volumes in the Republic of Armenia comes from those factors in the first place. Hence, it's so important for our compatriots who were forcefully displaced from Artsakh or in Armenia now are properly integrated, and the possibility of creating a workplace for them has to be effectively ensured, so that we have that boost that might bring some leveling playing field for demand supply, and we might not face a more aggravating situation that might result in more inflation. Thank you. Mr. Galstyan, several questions, a little deviated from the main topic. Do we have banks that experience financial problems now and might face closure? We've been hearing some information that's not ethically correct, I suppose, to say this at this moment, but I'm sure if you have that information you can deliver it now. And also, there were a lot of remittances from Russian Federation recently through various banks. That's not just Russian, but also Swiss banks handling Russian capital from Switzerland to Armenia. Some of the banks are trigger happy to get that over. The others should not, like Amiriat wouldn't, Artshin would. Other banks have different policies. So I'd like to know, is this given the Russian-Ukrainian war and the sanctions, is it possible that it all exposes our banks to more risk and they undergo sanctions? Thank you. Okay, deviating from the topic you said. Sometime later we might end up with the format where questions by Mr. Makaryan are about monetary policy. Nevertheless, I'll try that. So as regards to the banks, they're quite decently capitalized, meaning for the last 2 years they have been quite effective in generating revenues, and that has significantly contributed to the decisions by the central bank on anti-cyclic buffers. It's been quite well planned. So at the moment there is a shock in the banking system, but the banking system should be ready to respond, to react. I have no concerns at this moment that there are banks that experience problems. As regards the policies by the banks, then the central bank has permanently, incessantly tried to establish overall culture of governance and increase the standards for decision making, and the same culture, meaning we come up with requirements so that people who work in the banks are at full compliance, meaning those that are in charge of compliance, those that make decisions related to the creditability of the consumers, of the clients, whether accept that money or not accept that money, are extremely professional. That's what we need to have in the banks, so they are capable of making those decisions on their own, and that is why the central bank goes for further strengthening the standard, and we're going to be consistent and rigorous in this regard. At this moment, in our communication with international partners, we have not been hearing any concerns that there are certain actions in the financial system that might expose themselves to certain threats, or the system to certain threats in terms of sanctions. In very extreme, rare cases, there might be a couple of situations that are still quite obscure, quite confusing, like a Swiss company, the owner of which has a Ukrainian passport and operates somewhere else. It's hard to find indeed. However, the case is that if it's under sanctions, they would cease operating immediately. At least stop certain transactions. Okay, Mr. Galstyan, what standards have you strictened, could you please? And to what extent is that related to the question I raised? Sanctions, so that risks are also ensured. And it means that we may be sure, we may be confident that the Russian remittances or the transfer of Russian capital to the Armenian banks is not going to expose our banks to more risk. Well, we may rest assured that if there is an episode of the kind, we would definitely be responding or reacting to it, whereas actions at this moment are aimed at avoiding such episodes at all. How we've strengthened the standard. Most of the banks have found new specialists in compliance, money laundering, and terrorist financing functions, in these specific functions. So pay attention. If you inquire, you will see there is significant demand of such specialists by the banks currently, and we have created that demand by strengthening our requirements specifically. Like as regards anti-money laundering and terrorist financing activity, we've said that there have to be international certification of qualifications of specialists who are in charge for those in the banks. Their inner standards of recruiting specialists have to become stricter. That's what we mean. So when we hold the interviews, we've changed essentially the interviewing procedure, and we're looking at the issue from different angles. So this is quite complex, and I'm sure it's going to be yielding very soon at a certain moment. Well, we have it now too, but at a certain point we're going to be having a better functionally prepared environment. Thank you, Arka. Mr. Galstyan, your comments on the broker companies and intermediaries and investment platforms. Freedom Broker has been quite active recently, and also Aragats was currently coming into the play. It's been quite a lot of time that we've been witnessing the galvanization of investment companies, investment funds. Our legislation has been quite liberal, meaning taxation sector has been quite liberal, and supposedly that had to involve international players at the time. We may at least see that there has been some interest towards Armenia as a jurisdiction, meaning there are companies that are moving to Armenia for longer stay. But while linking it to the question by Mr. Makarin, I should say that we've had quite serious compliance requirements against them, and we're going to be strengthening them even further, because there is a risk that there might be transactions that might, to a certain extent, generate risks for the whole system. That's why we're going to be merciless there as well. Sputnik. I guess it's obvious now that the component of the demand that is directly related to inflation in unregulated services will reduce and continue reducing, as well as house appliances, part or furnishing, inflation continues to grow. So per your observation, it's because of lower demand? Meaning, is that the demand that drops? Maybe mortgage payers still have it, but Russians obviously don't. Or maybe the demand is still high, but banks, while considering higher rates, offer higher interest rate credits. Well, we discussed already the consumer credits. I mean, we have certain growth therein, essentially, and if I'm not mistaken, that's been about 17 to 18% per the most recent observation. Now it's 22, by the way. It's 22. And we have a larger volume there. So that's October or November, I'm sorry? That's by 31st of October. Nothing about November yet. Now as regards consumption, then we can see that internal consumption, retail consumption, has grown significantly. There is noticeable growth, part of which supposedly is because of the events in Artsakh, meaning people have arrived in Armenia. Naturally they would consume in Artsakh as well, but the shape and the substance of their consumption has changed here because they started from scratch, and there might be some precocious behaviors. But the other part is related to the phenomenon you just mentioned. Yes, we've built it. Now we're starting with the second stage, and those stages can be of continuous nature. Let's see how developments go. But if you look at the components of economic growth, then services have grown 11.4%, which is quite a significant amount. Mr. Galstyan conversed Artsakh significantly. One question, but I might ask that separately closer to the end of our conference. It's different than what we're discussing. So, while conversing the inflation, other main topics of our discussion, you conversed the real estate market. Construction, you said, booming currently. Supposedly it's fading now. At least that's what we've been noticing recently. Any analysis there for the last 3 months or 6 months? What have been the trends in the real estate market, and if it moves towards plummeting or collapse or reduction, to say the least? At least we are not seeing it now, but if it happens, then the overall trade volumes that are directly related to banks, because banks have been funding that, what would change? How would it change? How is it going to impact the banking system in general, and also inflation and economy ultimately? Thank you. I can give you several patterns. Just one observation. I guess these exaggerated numbers of real estate prices and all the other indicators, 2 digits, even 3-digit indicators, sometimes meaning re-export, export, import, etc. They have slightly put us away from the overall perception. Like 5% economic growth is a solid economic growth, is a good economic growth. Stable growth in the prices for estate is very good. We're more inclined to seeing this hyper growth. I mean, that's not realistic. We should never forget that being realistic matters, and we should focus on issues that might generate certain potential in the Republic of Armenia. Economic growth that is followed by demand, and the economic growth that emanates from fundamentals and brings more potential are two different things, and it's not the figure that matters, but the quality and the change that might follow or fall out of that. Now, as regards real estate, the buffers, LTVs, and other related tools, I mean, in the macro prudence, we've tried to do the following. If certain events generate the opposite effect in terms of the volumes of transactions or reduction in the prices for real estate, banks have to be ready. The banks have to be ready to absorb those risks with the capitals they have. It's hard to say what happens, what will happen, but we are very conservative, and our policy is based on risk management. It means that we do not just think about the time when flowers blossom, but we understand that it's never a bed of roses. Respectively, our policies are aimed at restraining those risks to a certain extent. Most of the decisions that we made last year, with a very positive year, by the way, was creation of those pads, soft kind of reactive capacity. Hike can tell you the details, by the way. So, to look at the figures, multi-apartment buildings of Yerevan, as Mr. Galstyan mentioned, we have 2.7% of growth in October. Compared to the previous year, that's 12.7%. Supposedly, these trends remained. As regards transactions, the transactions in the real estate market compared to previous year grew almost 15% for the same period of time for the last year. And if you look at the supply, then the construction permits, I mean the number of construction permits issued, with the designs and everything, this is the third quarter data. Significantly, we have been having significant growth, 10, 20, even 30%, depending on the indicator used in the formula. So essentially, both supply-wise, there is a lot of activity, a lot of growth, and demand-wise, the mortgage market is still very active. So by October this year, it had grown 20% already. I mean mortgages, and by October. I mean, we can say that on the real estate market there's significant activity, well maintained, and policies emanating therefrom, as mentioned by the governor. Okay, the overall volume of mortgages is over 1 trillion, by the way, by end of October. So we have about 1 trillion of mortgage and another 1 trillion of credits issued by the banks. Consumer credits, consumer loans, like it was 209 billion in 2018, 355, 481 per year. I mean, we're over 1 trillion now. As regards to the market, I mean the banks, just one more question. There is an estimate, there is a statement that with these unexpected revenues from the remittances, the banks kind of became less attentive, or lost the pace. But now competition kind of comes back because there are no windfall so-called revenues, or there are less than it was last year. So may we expect that in the coming months, or at least in the midterm, the competition will become more intensive among banks? That's our goal, by the way. That's our goal, to create such competition among banks that the customers ultimately benefit from that. Now, as regards the previous year, apart from looking at the banks, you should also consider the income of the clients of those banks, because last year we faced a situation the banks had been telling us about, and we see that in the figures too, that the revenue generated in the economy, specifically distributed per households and companies, essentially allowed for larger down payments and, of course, faster servicing of the debts, meaning they paid off faster than expected in the mortgage schedule. So the banks were looking into strengthening some of their functions on the one hand. On the other hand, the clients didn't mean to have that many loans anymore, because their income had grown significantly. Okay, as regards the labor market, the statistical data we're looking at points to this global warming phenomenon. I mean, you've been referring to very, very often, continues. And there's been growth in wages in non-manufacturing sector, and as regards recruiting new staff, it happens faster in the non-manufacturing sector. So I'm trying to understand whether this risk of over galvanization is taken into account in your decisions. Pay attention to services and construction. You can see significant growth, noticeable growth in those sectors. Obviously, the labor force flows towards the sectors where economic galvanization is observable. Now, as regards wages, we haven't simply considered the overall volume, but by the end of October we had wages by sectors, and there were 2 or 3 of the sectors. In one, there were even over 30% of growth in wages, and the other over 20% of growth in wages. But generally, the average was over 10%. That's the nominal salaries or wages. So we can see that there is some adjustment there in the labor market, and the chart that you can see here on the left side, by the way, just characterizes that phenomenon. You can see that at the peak, like in September last year, the nominal growth of wages had comprised about 30%. Currently, in the private sector, it's just 10% growth in salaries. Well, I also fell into that trap by just saying only 10%. Yeah, but there's 10% growth. Okay, so just looking at the situation. On the one hand, we have more people flowing towards services, more labor force, I mean. On the other, less remittances from the Russian Federation. Meanwhile, more tourists in November, right? No, less tourists in November. So, can we see a risk there, specifically related to the worse creditability or credit histories of these people? I mean, do we see any abrupt reductions there that might result in certain threats for households? Well, essentially, our policy is scenario-based. The second scenario is called Case B, essentially quite eloquently describing everything that you just tried to do in words. However, at this moment, we are discussing 10% growth in nominal salaries of the private sector. We're not speaking about 30% reduction, but we're saying that the pace of growth is 10% for the wages. We would all like to have 10% growth in our salaries every year, wouldn't we? which means in 7 years we could have doubled our salaries. So in that regard, the situation is not that catastrophic as you wanted to put it. As regards the risks, naturally we have considered that in the basis of our decisions we are merging scenarios, combining scenarios, and decisions the board makes is the decisions are based on those scenarios. Arka? Mr. Galstyan, what do we have with the crypto assets oversight model? And any ideas? Anything about the digital currency, Armenian drams? Well, there are discussions. Some things have been worked out. I wouldn't say we are ready to show anything. These are yet in-house discussions. As any new phenomenon, it deserves, of course, positives and negatives. I mean, there are advocates and there are antagonists on the other, so we've decided that beginning of next year we're going to further make it more intensify the discussions related to cryptocurrency. We have published our vision in a short memo, I'm sure you've seen it, and apparently this is the time for us or other public agencies to start moving in this direction, so that we further promote that legislation, maybe discuss it with the industry, and then government, National Assembly, and then decisions will be made. So, supposedly that's going to happen next year. Yes, supposedly. Mr. Markana, thank you. Mr. Galstyan, tell us a little about US dollar and euro currency rates. US dollars, no, and euros separately against Armenian drams, I mean, because 1 month ago I remember there was an increase by 10-20 Armenian drams, I mean in both euros and dollars, and so some concerning dynamics, I would say, and businesses also reacted, mentioned that there was certain there were certain uncertainties there. So I'd like to know how and why and what's happening now. Currently US dollar is 405 Armenian drams. Any trends for the latter increasing or maybe decreasing? Scenario wise, naturally the Armenian dram can become stronger or weaker. I can give you different scenarios. I can describe a scenario in which the Armenian dram can become weaker, like a situation where our external balance shifts towards the negative, where the Armenian dram will be devalued, or situations where there are more influx, more attractiveness and interest towards Armenia by investors, by people, by tourists. I mean, that might result in further strengthening of the national currency. However, the cornerstone here, I think, well, there are two cornerstones. The central bank doesn't consider currency as a goal. The goal is the inflation, is the change in prices. That's what we're looking at. And the second point, I think, and that makes me really happy, our compatriots have understood that emotions have no place in making currency-related decisions, because emotions ultimately harm themselves. We've learned that lesson in the most bitter way during the war in 2020. I think that we've learned the lesson well. I'm sure you remember the situation where they would stop their long-term deposits and convert Armenian drams to foreign currency and find some speculative stances on the market that ultimately deprived them of their own income. What happened in October could have contributed to that uncertainty to a certain extent. There were certain movements by the market players, we think, were not based on good foundations, in result of which the central bank had to intervene because the market had turned into something unilateral at a certain point. So per our rules, we had to respond. So that response was not very voluminous. Ultimately, it created a situation in the market that calmed it down. Since then, the central bank has had no interventions. It's quite a normal condition in the market right now, demand-supply wise. Time will show as regards the fluctuating currency rate. I mean, the complexity and the admirability thereof come together because there are numerous factors impacting it on the one hand. On the other hand, the fluctuating nature thereof allows countries like Armenia, with small and open economies, to absorb external shocks. Maybe balancing processes taking place in the country at the same time. How would you explain that short-term devaluation of Armenian dram? Uncertainty, emotions, some movements here and there, but I guess more emotions rather than reasoning. You said 20 drams, but at a certain moment it was almost 50 in a day, in a span of a day. Okay, one more thing to understand. This is about 400 now. So, as regards active turnover and indicators, is it an expedient, I would say, a convenient rate for us? What do you mean us? Armenian economy? No, I mean, I'm asking the question because there is no us here. There are importers, exporters, people who are not at all interested with the currency rates, exchange rates. I mean, because they get their salary in Armenian drams, they spend Armenian drams, they save Armenian drams. There are importers that would like stronger Armenian dram, obviously. There are exporters who would desire to have the opposite situation. So the market has currently decided that that's where the rate is going to be. No microphone. I remember the US dollar rate dropped a year and a half ago. There were these anxiety, quite anxious positions expressed by the businesses, saying that they would essentially buy in drams and sell in dollars and they would suffer a lot. Yes. There were moments in 30 years of Armenian dram, there were episodes where dram really became very weak. There were situations where it became very strong. And any businessman, any business person will have to get along with the reality that currency risks are just types of risks, and it's part of their business administration, modus operandi. Last question. Have you been noticing that the load of the burden of the deposits businesses had is depleted, turning into investments? I mean, data for the last month or two. Legal persons, resident legal persons, let's put it this way. Deposits, January till October 31, growing 7.2%. Foreign currency reducing 5.4%. Armenian dram growth is over 15. Okay, so nothing extraordinary, nothing scary, that they were depleted, lost, etc. Okay, may we conclude that the business is still saving and being cautious, not investing yet, not desiring to invest yet. Okay, so that I'm not answering that question, maybe seconding that attitude. For natural persons, deposit grew 13.5%. As regards long-term deposits, it's 11.5%. Natural persons, generally, it's 15%. For the corporates, 7%. Thank you.